Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back to Mr. Ulrich's LandofBiology.com. This is Mr. Ulrich. In this video, we're going to talk about circulation. We talked a little bit about how materials like oxygen can get into your bloodstream and carbon dioxide can get out. We've talked about how carbohydrates and water and material like that is absorbed into your bloodstream. We need to talk a little bit about your bloodstream. And here's where we're going to do it. Okay, as a life function, circulatory systems are transport systems. Some of the things that they are going to transport are things like, well, nutrients, things like blood gases that we've talked about in the last two organ systems that we've studied. They're also going to carry wastes, as we'll look into with the excretory system, and hormones with the endocrine system, and immune factors when we get into the immune system. So quite a busy thoroughfare there, our circulatory systems. We can describe our circulatory system as being closed because it has these three basic parts of a closed circulatory system. It has a pump, in our case a heart. It has some tubes, blood vessels, and it also has something to pump through those blood vessels. In our case it's blood. Things like starfish have a water-based vascular system. Open circulatory systems are missing one of those things. Fish tank is a good example of an open circulatory system, but they're not alive. So grasshoppers are also good examples of open circulatory systems. To see the difference between an open and closed, we can see that in a typical grasshopper, a typical open circulatory system of a grasshopper, there's a heart and there's hemolymph going through the heart, but the tubes don't really connect. They're kind of short, just like little nozzles, basically. So they don't really have continuous tubes. Whereas in an earthworm, which has a typical closed circulatory system, whole blood stays within the tubes in a continual lap all the way through, from one chamber all the way around to the heart again. Okay, well, if it's the tubes that make the difference, we should take a couple moments to look at these blood vessels. These are the tubes that carry blood. Blood vessels are defined by their direction of blood flow relative to the heart. So arteries take blood away from the heart to body tissues. So arteries away. They have relatively thick elastic and muscular walls because they are taking blood pressure from each contraction of the heart, and that causes them to have a pulse. We'll discuss this a little later when we get into cardiac circulation. If you look at the diagram down here, you can see the artery is pretty thick-walled. Arteries branch into smaller structures called arterioles. Those arterioles are going to branch into even smaller structures called capillaries. These are really tiny structures. They're very thin. Only a few blood cells can fit through them. A breast. They have very thin walls, which allows them to leak. This is why, as we were discussing before, they surround respiratory surfaces and the digestive surfaces, because those are places where materials are going to be exchanged between the blood and the environment. All of your tissues are going to be richly perfused with capillaries. That means there's going to be lots of capillaries going through them because these are also sites of exchange between the blood and body cells. And that's where the leakiness of the capillaries is really going to come into play. Those capillaries are going to come together into larger and larger structures called venules, which gather together into even larger structures called veins. These are going to bring the blood back to the heart for pumping. They have thinner walls than arteries. The blood is under much less pressure. After being squeezed through all of those capillaries, it kind of oozes into the veins. So not much blood pressure there. Because of the lack of blood pressure, they have valves to keep the blood from kind of backing up in between pumps of the heart. but even so, they don't have an appreciable pulse. So when we're going to be looking for a pulse, we're going to be looking for arteries. If we look at this picture again, we can compare the artery to the vein and really see the difference now between the thickness of the wall of the artery and the thinness of the wall of the vein. The strange looking structure looks almost like a piece of bread or something there in cross section across the middle. That's a valve. So here we can see just kind of all of the structures kind of put together in one schematic. The arteries branching or having arterioles branch off of them, which branch into smaller capillaries, which just have that one cell layer and some connective tissue around them, coming back together into venules and eventually into veins, and the veins bringing the blood back to the heart. Point out here the color of the blood in veins in this diagram is listed as blue. Your blood is not blue. The connective tissue that makes up the vein is blue because they have less red muscle in them. What we see is the more of the connective tissue than the red muscle tissue. That's why veins look blue. It's not the blood that's inside of them. Most of my students come into biology having heard of arteries and veins, and usually even capillaries and the blood that goes through them. What they don't have much of an exposure to is the whole other set of tubes, a whole other transport system called the lymphatic system in our bodies. We talked about the material leaking out of the capillaries. We'll talk about plasma later, but the job of plasma is to carry all of the material that's in the blood, and as that plasma leaks out, it brings the good material to all of the body cells. That's how the exchange takes place between the blood and body tissues. But that fluid needs to go somewhere. It can't just go to the cells and stay there, and so it drains off into the lymphatic system, into these tubes, into collecting tubes that are throughout the whole body. These tubes have valves for one-way flow. The only pumping of them is the movement of skeletal muscles, squeezing on them and forcing the lymph back towards the ducts where it go back into the circulatory system. And we'll stop right there. We'll get into cardiac circulation in another video. I want to thank you for tuning in to MrOlwertsLandofBiology.com. You can always get the supporting material for these lectures and other good stuff on my website at MrOlwertsLandofBiology.com. Please feel free to email me with some feedback or constructive criticism on my videos, or if you have images or other supporting material that would be good to include in these videos, that would be much appreciated, and if you're a student, certainly would get you some extra credit. Once again, thanks for tuning in. Bye. See you in class.